The second James Comey opened his mouth, the courtroom erupted like someone had lit a fuse. The judge snapped upright, leaned in with ice-cold authority, and barked, "Close your mouth, now." And I'm telling you, the shift in power was like watching a storm roll in instant, overwhelming, unavoidable. Comey tried every trick in his old playbook, pivoting, posturing, pretending he was the unfairly targeted hero of some media sob story. But the judge was done entertaining him. Just 7 minutes before that blow-up, the government had filed a notice confirming the grand jury did meet, did vote, and did approve the charges. And right there, the entire mainstream media storyline collapsed, like it was made of soggy paper. Comey froze, shocked and cornered, caught in a moment he couldn't spin his way out of. The judge ordered him out, and he walked away in dead silence. And that's exactly when the unraveling truly started. You can always tell when the Democratic establishment realizes they've stepped into a mess they created, because suddenly, the same voices who spoke with fake certainty just a day earlier start tripping over their own explanations. But this time, the backlash wasn't coming from Republicans at all. It was coming from inside their own camp. A Democrat dropped the receipts, posted the filing. And the second it hit the public, the media's whole carefully crafted narrative folded instantly yesterday. The networks were swearing the indictment was some kind of clerical screw-up. They insisted the grand jury never voted and that the government was scrambling in panic mode. They pushed that angle nonstop, acting like they'd uncovered a massive DOJ failure. Then the transcript surfaced showing the judge personally verifying the vote and the grand jury foreperson answering yes without hesitation. A single word, a single line. And the media storyline they had milked all day evaporated on the spot. What does that tell you? It shows just how desperate some Democrats were to spin the situation before the documents even landed. They rushed a narrative into the bloodstream, fed it to their favorite anchors, and congratulated themselves like they'd won something meaningful. And now they're pretending the whole thing never happened. This is what political humiliation looks like in real time, not loud, not fiery, just that slow, uncomfortable shuffle when someone realizes everyone saw them trip over their own lies. And the irony, it's absolutely priceless. A Democrat, not a MAGA Republican, not conservative media, is the one calling out the misinformation. Someone from their own side saying, "You guys completely botched this." And instead of admitting it, the elite press is quietly rewriting headlines, tiptoeing backward, hoping the public doesn't notice who misled them yet again. But people see the pattern. Every time the establishment tries to smear Trump or anyone connected to him, they end up revealing their own double standards. Every single time. That's why so many Americans are finished trusting the political class. They assume the public is too clueless to notice contradictions. They perform these little media plays, push whatever benefits their side in the moment. And when the truth finally drops, they scatter like the whole thing never happened. But eventually, that kind of dishonesty circles back. You can only mislead people so many times before they start calling you out. And now, even Democrats are the ones lifting the curtain. If the ruling elites thought this stunt would hurt Trump's circle, the opposite happened. They embarrassed themselves again. And everyone watched it unfold. What really stands out is how quickly the establishment braces itself. The second one of their own faces genuine accountability. The moment a prosecutor steps toward the truth. Suddenly, a Biden-appointed judge starts tossing around charged language, trying to paint her as some political pawn. That's not strength. That's insecurity. They're terrified the old protective wall around the FBI's former leadership is finally cracking. Ordinary Americans see it clearly. The same elites who spent years preaching about norms and integrity are now bending those norms whenever the case cuts too close to their own allies. They can't defend Comey on the facts, so they attack the person doing her job. It's the exact tactic the corporate media uses every time a story threatens their narrative: go after the messenger. Never address the misconduct itself. And the irony hits hard. After everything Comey pulled, after the damage he inflicted on public trust, the system he once weaponized is now becoming a trap for the very people who shielded him. That's the boomerang effect, their own tactics snapping back at full force. Accountability always finds its target. Now we get to the ruling itself, one of the most staggering rebukes of the Department of Justice we've seen in years. A federal judge essentially told the DOJ, "You crossed the line. You contaminated the grand jury process, and now your case might fall apart." That is not normal. That's not routine. That's a judge slamming brakes on a political engine that assumed no one would dare confront them. And this wasn't just a minor slip-up. The judge said the DOJ undermined the integrity of the grand jury, the very mechanism they used to indict people. The same mechanism they've used aggressively against Trump supporters, conservatives, and anyone the establishment sees as a threat. But when it involves James Comey, suddenly the rules bend. The judge ordered the DOJ to turn over grand jury materials to Comey's defense, something that almost never happens. Grand jury proceedings are supposed to remain sealed. But Comey's lawyers pointed out enough irregularities, enough strange gaps, enough questionable handling, that the judge essentially said, "I want to see everything." And the defense gets to see it too. That's how badly the DOJ mishandled this case. Back in 2017, the FBI seized emails and documents from Daniel Richman, Columbia law professor, Comey's friend, and more importantly, his lawyer. The initial investigation into Richmond fizzled out. The evidence collected was supposed to be sealed or destroyed. But when the DOJ later went after Comey, accusing him of giving information to Richmond and lying to Congress about it, they went back to that old evidence without a new warrant and may have accessed privileged communications. The judge flagged all of it. Normally, DOJ uses a taint, team separate agents completely walled off to prevent contamination. That didn't happen here. One of the agents who viewed this material even testified before the grand jury. Then you add in questionable statements from interim U.S. Attorney Lindsay Halligan, the one brought in after career prosecutors refused to bring charges, and you get a grand jury process full of holes. The judge's order is heavily redacted. But one thing is clear. Indictments were returned incorrectly, resubmitted. And there is a mysterious gap where no transcript or record exists at all. And that's why this matters. When there are serious defects in a grand jury indictment, it can blow up the entire case. The judge knows it. The DOJ knows it. And Comey's defense team absolutely knows it. And that's where the story ends for now, right at the moment when the very system Comey once trusted to protect him may be the one that finally turns the lights on. It was supposed be over. The evidence was supposed to be sealed or destroyed. That's what thoroughs say. But then when the DOJ latter decided to go after Comey himself for allegedly leaking info through Richmond and then allegedly lying about it to Congress, they quietly went back to that old evidence. They didn't get a new errant. They didn't respect the fact this was supposed to be sealed. And worse, they started poking around in communications that might be privileged beat Comey and his own lawyer. The judge looks at that and basically says, "What are you people doing? This is basic constitutional stuff." Here's why that matters beyond James Comey. When the DOJ cuts corners on warrants and attorney-client privilege, that doesn't just hurt one defendant. It erodes the protections every American is supposed to have. If they can reuse sealed evidence against someone like Comey, what do you think they feel free to dodo some unknown citizen with no money, no platform, no lawyers on TV? This is same government that lectures Trump and his supporters about respecting constitutions while it quietly bends thoroughs inside those institutions whenever rot suits them. You just go to the grand jury and you get a new indictment. The issue, in this case, of course, is the statute of limitations will have run thought 5-year statute. That's why this was all critical in this case. The indictment is dismissed. It's going too late to go back and charge Comey. Yeah. This is a whole mess in terms of what you just laid forth with those twop wrong, those missteps, as the judge stated in terms of this. The judge also said, quote, The court recognizes thought relief sought by the defense is really granted. How rare do we ever see this? It's very rare, Andy. I could tell you during all my years as a federal prosecutor, I never had a case like this. First of all, you never have Simeon with no prosecution experience echoing into the grand jury. That's probably why we had some of this missteps. But even if you look at that time period, it took 2 hours for Fed grand jurors to return this indictment. And obviously, they didn't retort in it on all the counts. I could you in all the times. And I went to the grand jury many times. Took 'em maybe 5-10 minutes max. So this is not your typical case. And normally, grand jury proceedings are secret. The defense, they can't get transcripts of the proceedings. But back, because of what happened here with the Setwo indictments. The potential light-proof material, Halagan bringing 2 indictments to the courtroom well after. 6 p.m., really, it was a race against the clock. They were rushing. So this is not your typical case, and the judge acknowledged that. That's why this relief would really be extraordinary. That's why the government is trying to do everything they can to stop it, because they realize that they have some vulnerabilities here. There's some protections, privilege, attorney-client privilege. There's a privilege against self-incrimination. The Fifth Amendment that was apparently talked about during the grand jury, which usually you're not supposed to do. And, of course, there's constitutional prex, including the statute of limitations. So there's a lot at stake here, which means the judge is going to take a look at this case very closely. And we're not even talking about the selective or vindictive prosecutions or avend. It doesn't stop there. The judge found massive problems in how the grand jury itself was handled. There were 2 different versions of the indictment floating around. The grand jury originally returned charges on only 2 free counts. But when prosecutors went to the magistrate, they brought 2 versions, one of them wrong. And then there's this mysterious gap in their court. A period of time where there's no grand jury transcript, no recording, no clear explanation of what happened as they rushed to fix their own mistake. The judge flat out called the record incomplete. Guys, that's not a typo. That's not, oops, we forgot a form. That's the heart of the process. Grand juries are supposed to be the safeguard, the filter between the citizen and the government. And yet, when it's politically convenient, the same dozier lectures the country about our Sacred norms treats that grand jury lakia. Rubber stamp it can rush through at 6 p.m. before the statute of limitations hits. That's the through line here. One standard when they're targeting Trump. Another standard when the establishment wants to rearrange the damage around one of its own, like James Comey. Even the former federal prosecutor in this Fox segment, Admicho Extraordinary, this is. He says their leave Comey's defense is asking for that. The judge is seriously weighing is really granted. In all his years as a federal prosecutor, he never saw a case like this. That tells you how far outside the norm this conduct is. When people who spent their careers inside this system are saying, I've never seen this before. You're dealing with something more than a paperwork glitch. And there's another detail that jumped out at me. Grand juries usually take 5, maybe 10 minutes to return an indictment. In a federal case like this, it's almost automatic. But here, it took 2 hours. 2 hours of deliberation, 2 hours of hesitation, 2 hours where very everyday citizens in that grand jury room clearly weren't comfortable. Rubber stamping what the DOJ put in front at them. When the people are hesitating and the bureaucracy is rushing, the system is out of balance. Arguments that the defense has on the merits. In this case, that this wasn't a false statement or it wasn't. Material, we're talking about the defect in the procedural proceedings themselves. And it could derail this whole prosecution that many people have been wanting Whether you're on the right or left, there's a lot of people that don't like Comey. Boothus is a potentially big problem in the case. Andy, and we've seen lots of motions by Comey's defense team. And I want to ask because it feels like this is a vias coming out with this saying missteps Anthea was an undermining of an integrity with the grand jury proceedings. Is this a precursor to a potential dismissal? It is. And the best defense is always a good offense. And I think here the defense does have the prosecution on Theron of it. Now, obviously, look, we're just talking about a magistrate judge. That is a lower level judge. They don't have the authority to dismiss a case. They just make recommendations to a district judge. That judge, of course, can dismiss a case, and of course the government would appeal. If there were a dismissal, it would go up to the circuit court, which would be the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. That's a intermediate-level appellate court. Then, of course, a case like this with important legal and political consequences may end up all way before the U.S. Supreme Court. So there's a lot at stake. This is just the first step with that magistrate judge. Certainly not the end of the road diet, but really the process is moving for a potential dismissal, which won't ever see at the grand jury level. I mean, really. These are just sort off rubber stamps to get the indictment, get charges, and move forward with the case. So the fact that the defense is already able to attack a vulnerability, it's certainly a bad sign for the prosecution because normally this is not something they ever have to deal with. We'll see how much longer this indictment may be on the books. Nima, my last question before I let you go, because we talk about the special appointment of Lindsay Halligan, a person that really hasn't ever prosecuted a case. Also, the timetable for those statute of limitations. Talking about the integrity of this. What's next for Lindsay Halligan? If they say that she did this vindictively, asked defense is saying, what's the future for her? Now, here's the real political earthquake hiding underneath all this. Normally, if a grand jury indictment is defective, the government just shrugs and says, we'll go back and get another round. But in this case, the judge points out the clock has basically run out. The 5-year statute of limitations is through. If the indictment gets taza back because of all these missteps, it's too late to recharge Comey. The case doesn't just get delayed, it dies. The weapon they tried to build backfires in their own hands. And you'll notice something. When it's Trump, the system bends every rule to keep the case alive. Venue shopping, novel theories, creative charges, you name it. When it's Comey, the guy who greenlit the Russia hoax, the guy who stood at the center of the anti-Trump machine in 2016 and 2017, the Doge waits until the last possible sect, then sloppily rushes through privileged material and a broken grand jury process. That's not an accident. That's what a two-tier justice system looks like in real time. What I see in this story is not just Comey versus Doge. I see a panicked establishment trying to protect its narrative. They couldn't let this case play out cleanly because a clean process would force them to put uncomfortable facts under oath on their cord where the American people could see them. So instead, they tried to backdoor the whole thing using a false statement charge tied to an old leak they let expire. And when you try to sneak something through the legal system, the 11th hour, sometimes the judge notices. Here, the judge noticed. The commentator in this segment lays it out clearly. If they wanted to go after Comey, honestly, they had years to do it. They could have brought a straightforward case during Trump's first term on the original leak. Instead, they waited until the statute of limitations ran on the leak, then tried to resurrect the whole thing by accusing him of lying about it later. That's not how justice is supposed to work. That's how political damage control works when the clock has already struck midnight. Well, it's certainly going to be a terrible look for her politically, right? She'll have, egg on her fees if she really botched this indictment. Let's not forget, she has experience, but it's primarily unsoren's experience, right? She's never prosecuted a single case. And for your first case to be a high-profile case like Atheus, that, it's likely going to challenged every step of the way. Comey had a very defiant tone. It came out on social media. Obviously, he's a lawyer himself, not just the former director of the FBI, so he's going to fight this case and push it to trial. So if Halligan were to lose this case on an important procedural technicality, that's a big problem. Now, it wouldn't necessarily affect the Letitia James case. Obviously, everyone's talking about that because if there's a problem her appointment, or if there's a problem with the grand jury indictment in that case, they still have time to go back and get a correct indictment. But by waiting so long in this case, it's a potential problem for the DOJ if they wanted to go after Comey. They realized should have during the first Trump administration for the original leak. They're really trying to backdoor this case because they know the statute was on the leak. They're trying to backdoor this case by charging him for making a false statement about the leak thought. The statute is already run and they did it at the 11th hour. So that's why they're running into these problems. If they did so in a timely manner, they wouldn't be in this situation. So this case is very different from the Letitia James case in my opinion. All right, Nima. Very interesting and obviously good detail on the developments of this. The judge making this ruling today. I appreciate your time, your reporting. Your endorsed standing here on Live Now from Fox. Thanks again. Thanks. Dandy, talk soon. And I want you to think about the broader pattern. The same DOJ and FBI THAT twisted FISA warrants on Trump associates. That ran with the Steele dossier that leaked like crazy to their friends in the corporate media, are now getting called out in court for mishandling evidence, trampling privilege, and botching a grand jury INA case tied back to James Comey. It's the same network, the same culture, the arrogance. They really believed Thurls were just some obstacle for the little people, not for them, in my view. What this judge did by forcing transparency on the grand jury material sand. Calling out the misconduct is the closest thing we've seen in a while to the system turning around and telling DOJ, sit down, shut your mouth, follow the law like everybody else. It doesn't fix everything. It doesn't magically restore trust, but it cracks the facade. It shows that even inside a legal establishment, there are still a few people willing to say enough. You don't get to rig the process and then lecture America about norms. So where does this go next? The magistrate judge can only recommend a district judge will decide whether to toss this indictment. If that happens, the DOJ, this thing could climb to the Fourth Circuit, maybe even the Supreme Court. But the damage to the narrative already done. The story is no longer Comey in the hot seat. The story is Dodge mishandled the case so badly, the court is considering the nuclear option. For a lot of Americans watching this, it confirms what they've felt for years. The people who claim to defend our democracy have been playing by their own privateral book. At the end of the day, this isn't about whether you like or hate James Comey. This is about whether the most powerful law enforcement agency in the world is still bound by the Constitution or whether they can just improve their way to whatever resolve political class. Once that week, today, a judge pushed back. Today, the masks slipped just a little. And if we keep paying attention, if we refuse to let corporate media bury stories like this, more Americans are going to see exactly how this game has been played and why it has to change.